All. Hope you're all well. Welcome to another session of CNOS. And today, specifically, we're looking at revision of the upcoming test. I think we mentioned this in our previous lectures, that obviously, as our assessments are approaching, I think it's imperative for us to actually start working on preparation for them. And obviously that is through the revision of past assessments, your test in this particular instance specifically, and then obviously after that particular test is concluded, then we will start working on revision of the actual exam itself. So I think I've mentioned before that we're left with two distinctive chapters to conclude module content, which is learning unit number 7, specifically chapters 13 and 14. And then we should be good to go, obviously, as far as module content at large there is concerned. If my memory serves me correct, I think when it comes to your upcoming test, should be on the 14th of October. So I've already uploaded a revision session rather for the 2019 paper. I think I've set a link as far as that particular session there is concerned. That environment was literally more for a scenario where you're obviously coming in to campus and sitting down and writing this particular a test or assessment. But as it stands right now on your pads, it's listed as a take-home assessment. So if there are any changes, I'm sure that the campus will give you heads up way beforehand. But as it stands, it's a take-home assessment. So I think it's important to realize that when it comes to take-home, obviously the materials are the same, where the actual questions are going to be coming from, but the way in which the questions are asked are slightly different, because take home is literally the same as a open book assessment, right? So in that particular instance, I think you obviously would get more marks for appropriate illustration of understanding concepts, as opposed to just plugging out content exactly as it is from the textbook or from whichever material or literature that you'd use, as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So you'll discover that while they might still bring such questions as list this and that, they'll then ask you to possibly explain or state what particular architecture you prefer, and then give your reasoning or justify your answer. Those are the kind of questions that you'd get that are not just looking at you plugging in content as it is from whichever source material, but also showing your distinct understanding of concepts at large in that regard. So I think that's the only difference that is there. But the other thing as well, or that's the only major difference, maybe if you look at it from a different perspective. The other thing as well that you need to remember is that because of the open book nature of it, it's imperative for you to obviously ensure that you reference appropriately. I think I've mentioned this when we were looking through your assignment, and I've mentioned the fact that if you're still not comfortable with your referencing, please make sure that you have a quick sit down with the librarian on campus. I think you should be able to also set up an online meeting, if possible, for convenience sake, across both parties, to ensure that you're schooled accordingly as far as a referencing platform there is concerned. Because naturally, since it's second semester, there's a generic understanding, or general understanding rather, that everyone now is sorted as far as referencing there is concerned. Now, because of the actual intricate nature, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, of the actual assessments, or the importance of the actual assessments, you want to avoid losing marks as far as your particular test or exam there is concerned, because that obviously would be detrimental to the actual or final mark, right? Which would obviously look at determining whether you actually pass or fail the module at large. So just make sure that when you're answering these questions, you make sure that you use your proper in-text referencing as well as bibliography page at the end of the document before you submit. Remember, on campus, I think we are distinctively still sticking with the Harvard referencing style. So just make sure that you are comfortable with that particular type of referencing, just to avoid any discrepancies at the end of the day. So with the format in terms of submission, I think they'll give you a heads up in terms of when the actual test or exam would be available off your Blackboard platforms. Then you're obviously given time to complete and then upload that particular assessment. So make sure you stick to the timeframes, because obviously if you miss those, then ultimately that literally nullifies your submission, or you won't be able to submit. So just make sure that you take distinct cognizance of the actual timeframes when the particular assessment is going to be uploaded, or when it's available either off your portal or the Blackboard platform, and then make sure that you complete it within the stipulated time frame, so that you can obviously submit it in time, just to avoid any discrepancies in that regard. So what we'll be looking at in today's session, like I mentioned before, is a 2020 past test paper that was also written in pretty similar circumstances, because of the situation on a global scale that has been taking place over the past almost 2 years now. So it was also a take-home assessment. So you'll discover that the questions are inclined to that. When you compare it to the 2019 paper, the 2018, 2017, and so on, you'll find that there are differences in the way in which you are then supposed to incorporate content and mark allocations, as opposed to the previous years. And actually, like I was mentioning, where you're coming in, sitting for exam, you have your generic multiple choice based questions, you've got your match columns, you've got your scenario based questions, or your long based questions. So the take home, naturally, you'll still find your multiple choice, but in certain instances, you might encounter a scenario where they give you a statement or give you a scenario and ask you to state the actual either technology that is being referred to, or the app that is being referred to, you name it. Or when you look at your match columns, you'll find that one column is populated and then the other one is blank. You'd obviously need to populate accordingly, whichever technology or description dependent. But obviously with your conventional assessments, you'll discover that you've got both columns populated. All you're supposed to do is then match accordingly as far as your particular setup there is concerned. You'll find that some papers would also come with true, false questions, although that has been a while since they've been used as far as these particular assessments would go. With your true false, you're looking at identifying a statement that is false, and then you're asked to then either correct that statement or state the reason why it's false. And then obviously got mark allocations in that regard. So that's the makings of your true false questions. And then the other types of questions that you'll find would be the missing words, where you obviously have to fill in the blanks as far as your particular environment there is concerned. So what we're going to do is just quickly delve into the 2020 paper there, just to familiarize yourself with what is happening in that regard. Just give me 2 seconds here while I quickly share my screen here. Right, so that's your paper at large. By default, these test papers normally 60 marks, and obviously pass mark is 50% as far as your particular mark allocation there is concerned. So with a sit-down test, it's 60 marks, naturally 1 hour to complete it, and you're given between 5 to 10 or 15 minutes reading time as far as the actual paper is concerned, so that you can distinctively identify the kind of setup associated with the paper, and possibly just mark or start working with the questions that you're more comfortable with as far as content would go. So if this, for any reason or the other, changes into an actual sit-down test, it means that obviously, when it comes to the way in which you answer the questions, I'm not too particular in terms of the order, but I need you to ensure that if you have a 4 question paper or a 5 question paper, for argument's sake, should you decide to start with question 3, make sure that you complete question 3 in its entirety before you move on to the next one, right? When it's a sit-down test, or when it's an actual test that you're coming into campus to work on, I'm not too particular in as far as the actual order of completion of these particular questions, but it's imperative for you to make sure that you, once you start a question, you complete it in its entirety before you move on to the next one. You want to avoid a scenario where you start with question 3, you do half of it and you move on to question 1, you come back to question 3 and so on. That becomes a bit of a haphazard type of way of completing your paper, and you ultimately end up losing marks in that regard. But now, if it stays as a take-home assessment, then you need to make sure that you answer your questions in chronological order. Right? Because this is literally the same thing as an assessment, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. So you start with question 1, you go to question 2, you end with whatever question number that is there, but ensure that you answer your questions in chronological order, just to avoid discrepancies in that regard. So like we were mentioning earlier on, just make sure that you obviously reference accordingly. You'll have instructions that are populated obviously on the actual first 2 pages of the actual paper itself that will give you a heads up in terms of what you'll need to take into consideration. So for instance, if you look at what I was mentioning a couple of seconds ago, especially if you look at your 6 there, it mentions that marks will be awarded for the quality of your paraphrasing, right? And even the point that's preceding that, it says there you should paraphrase, in brackets, use your own words, the concepts that you are referencing rather than quoting directly. All right, so it's important for you to make sure that you show an understanding of whatever it is that's being asked of, as opposed to you just copying and pasting from a textbook or a set of slides or whatever literature or material that you find that is relevant in accordance to the actual question that is being asked of. So just ensure that you take cognizance of that specific fact, that more marks will be allocated to individuals that demonstrate an understanding of the concept, as opposed to someone who just plugs in content exactly as it is in that regard. So when you look at so that's your instructions. I think you have enough time naturally to look through that. Just make sure that you undertake that accordingly. So you've got your multiple choice questions here, right? Normally you find it's either 1 mark as a minimum per section, or per question as far as your multiple choice section there is concerned, or a maximum of 2 marks in that regard. And in certain instances, you find that instead of having 5 questions, you'll have 10 of them incorporated. Same difference applies when you're looking at the match column section as well, as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So the first question there is looking at a new browser that is shipped with Windows 10. What is it called? So I think obviously with the previous editions or previous versions or previous contributions associated with your Windows operating system, the browser came part and parcel as with the actual OS itself. So it came as one of the applications bundled within the actual operating system itself. And that particular browser was your Internet Explorer. But obviously, with certain discrepancies across the years there, that a lot of users were not too happy, comfortable, or satisfied with the actual makings of, as far as that particular browser there is concerned. Most individuals complained that it was a bit slow, sometimes possibly had certain compatibility issues with certain applications or programs, you name it. So there obviously was a need for some kind of upgrade as far as setup there is concerned. So Windows 10 naturally would also come with a particular browser bundled within that particular setup. And the browser that you're looking at in this regard is going to be your Microsoft Edge. So your Microsoft Edge there becomes your default go-to as far as the browser would go. The previous paper, 2019, I looked at this particular question as well. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Please make sure that you look through that particular clip as well. When you look at 1.3, on the other hand, you're looking at now a bit of a scenario where you've plugged in a USB portable hard drive onto an older machine, and obviously the disk has not appeared as available. Right, so you're connected to the hard disk controller as far as, or you're concerned rather, as far as the hard disk controller there is concerned. Obviously, it not being recognized by the actual computer system. So they've mentioned here what utility would enable us to verify whether this particular controller is functioning accordingly or not. So remember, we also have that specific lecture that has been uploaded over the past couple of weeks now, that discusses the utilities associated with Windows 10, right? And the other thing as well is you will discover that this particular question is also to a certain extent related to the 2.3 question as far as your assignment is concerned. Why? Because in this particular instance now, remember, when you're looking at I think the catch here is the controller part, right? If it was anything else, most individuals would want to argue that, okay, look, you can also use the disk management console to just check what is actually happening with the disk appearing there, what's happening with the actual configuration at large. But remember, your disk management platform normally just shows you, obviously, your connected drives. It shows the actual partitions associated with the actual drives. It also shows you the file system associated with the drives at large, as far as configurations would go. So you'll also even discover what type of disk it is. Is it a basic disk or a dynamic disk in that regard? But when you're discussing controllers, this forms part and parcel of, you could say, core hardware. Right. So ultimately, the particular utility that will enable you to do that would be your device manager. And remember, when you look at your device manager, this is distinctively a control panel applet, right, within your Microsoft operating system. And what it does is that it allows users to view and control hardware attached to the actual computer system. So your device manager now is the default go-to in that regard, because obviously when a piece of hardware is not working, the literal offending hardware is then highlighted for the user to deal with in that regard. So your device manager in this particular instance is the one that you'd want to work with as far as verifying whether you've got your controllers there working accordingly. And then when you look at 1.4, so with questions like this, you'll also discover the same for 1.5 as well, that it's again imperative for you to make sure that you read the question accordingly, right? Spend enough time, because you've got enough time in that regard. So make sure that when you read the question, you understand it accordingly, and you quite aware, if you look at it from a different point of view, of what it is that you're being asked of. In that question there, 1.4, before even completing it, by the time you get to what security feature prevents malware, most individuals would jump into an anti-malware package, and Windows Defender becomes your default go-to in that regard. But you forget that the last part of the question mentions that by limiting user privilege levels. So automatically that changes the question completely. If the question ended at malware there, then naturally you can get away with Windows Defender. But the moment they mention that by limiting user privilege levels, that's already a different thing altogether. Because remember, when you look at your specific environments there, you've got your default admin account that you'd obviously use to literally do anything and everything on the system, whether it's adding new users, reconfiguration of applications, reinstallation, configuration of the system at large. That particular administrator account has got all rights and permissions to do anything and everything on the system. So normally when you log in as a standard user or you log in as a guest and you end up trying to either install certain software or reconfigure the system, I think you've already experienced this on campus before. There's a pop-up there that then obviously prompts you to enter the required administrator username and password for you to proceed with that particular reconfiguration, installation, whatever it is that you want to do. That will obviously need elevated privileges in that regard. So in this particular instance, what you're actually looking for directly there is your UAC. That's what that particular pop-up is all about, to literally confirm that you've got the credentials, you've incorporated the right credentials, and then naturally proceed to the next step. So what you're looking at in this particular instance is your user account control as far as contributions there is concerned. So your option 2 there becomes your default go-to. And then lastly, we've got a networking question. And again, like I mentioned before, if you look at that closely there, when it comes to material, you can use what you've gone through as far as your network architecture module is concerned. And again, you can also have a look at the Windows 10 networking lecture that is uploaded on the channel, right? Because this just is looking at understanding exactly what's happening with IPv4, especially when you're looking at identifying the network portion of that particular IP address versus the actual host portion as far as your setup there is concerned. So naturally, in this particular instance, the type of address that we've got there is a class C address. Remember, by default, you've got the 5 classes, A, B, C, all the way to E. And then we've mentioned before that your D and E are not literally used by the general public. Why? Because those are reserved for research, experimentation, and broadcasting, as well as multicasting. So your A, B, and C are your available ranges as far as usage would go. Within those ranges, you obviously have private addressing schemes that will obviously enable better management of your IP addresses if you look at it from a different perspective. So with every particular IP, or whichever way you look at it, if you want to look at it specifically, you've got the class A with a specific range, you've got class B with a specific range, you also have class C with a specific range. But now in each one of those classes, again, like we mentioned a couple of seconds back, you'll need to be able to identify which portion of the IP address represents the network, which portion of the IP address represents the host. What enables you to do that is the subnet mask, right? And in each one of those classes, A, B, and C, you've got a default subnet mask, right? Which means that if you generically get a class A address, there's a mask that is there that enables you to identify that for class A, the first portion is network, the last 3 portions of the IP address are host. And then when you look at class B, same difference applies. The first 2 represent your network, the last 2 represent the actual host. And when you look at a class C address and you're dealing with a default mask, then the first 3 represent your network, the last one represents your host. In this particular instance, without going into too much detail, because this is familiar territory for all of us, if you look at the default mask and you get the IP, what this means with the 255.255.255.0, what it means for us is that our network ID, given that particular IP address, is now 192. The first 3 portions of that IP address is what is literally representing your network. So 192.112.0 there becomes our network ID. Right. So if you look at this closely here, this is our network address. right? The 0 there does not represent anything because we don't have a node in that particular instance. With the network ID, we're just identifying what the actual network is, right? So that's what your subnet mask could do for us for question number 1.5 there. So the 255.255.255.0 just literally tells us from a very superficial perspective that the first three portions of our IP address there is representing the actual network. So with the options that we've got your 10.0.0.0.45 there. That automatically is a class A private address. That's not within our same network range. So that one is automatically out. And then if you look at 192.168.113 there, that is also automatically out because obviously our network address is 112, right? And then when you look at 192, the third one, 192.168.112, that's the same network, and then .257. If you're not careful, automatically number 3 becomes our default go-to because that's in the same network, right? You've got 192.168.112 there, which is exactly the same thing that we've got as far as our network ID there is concerned. But here's a catch. For an IP version 4 address, right? The minimum number is 0 decimal, and then the maximum number is 255. Isn't it? So what this then means is that automatically that particular contribution for us, while it shows the right network, the last number for the host here is invalid, right? So option 3 there is an invalid IP address because you've gone beyond. Remember, it's a 32-bit address, right? So each of the 4 portions that you see there is represented by 8 bits. Right, so the maximum of your 8-bit configuration there. Remember, with a binary numbering system, your minimum number is 0, your maximum number is 1. So when you're looking at it from an 8-bit perspective, the maximum there is 8 ones. Those 8 ones translate to 255 in decimal. So number 3 there, or option 3, is automatically wrong because it's an invalid IP address. For 4, that one is in class, that is distinctively class B, right? That's a private address in class B, so that is out. So your question, sorry, the option rather that you find that is relevant there is option 5, 192.168.112.5, because that is a valid IP address as far as your particular setup there is concerned. Right, so that's your multiple choice section there as far as the contributions is concerned. 1.1 is for your 1.2, like I mentioned before, that's in the previous session. Go and have a look at that. And then 1.3 would be 4, and then your 1.4 is 2, and then naturally your 1.5 there would be 5. And then now you've got question 2, which is your literally your match column type of question. But as you can see, since it's a take-home type of setup, your column B has got no contributions. You actually have to know specifically what the distinctive, or you have to literally populate manually, maybe if you want to look at it from a different point of view, what the actual term or technology is in that regard. If it was a sit-down test, like I mentioned before, column B would obviously be populated with the answers there, and then you have to match them accordingly as far as your particular setup would go. So you've got the first one, which is your ADK. And remember, ADK is short for Assessment and Development Kit. So that's your Windows Assessment and Development Kit. And remember, when you look at installation, I think this is one of our first 2 lectures, if I'm not mistaken. When you look at any particular type of OS installation, what you're looking at in that regard is what they call an attended as well as an unattended installation. So when it's attended, you're actually sitting in front of your machine, and then you're responding literally to what you're being asked of when you try and install your operating system, or you are installing your operating system. So you experienced this when we were running the the setup for our assignments, right? You select your ISO, and then once that particular ISO is loaded, files are extracted. Then they ask you which particular operating system that you want to install, what is your region, keyboard layout, which particular version of the operating system are you going to go, Pro, Home, or Enterprise? And then from there, you then need to specify you actually reading the end user license agreement. After that, you now need to specify whether it's a custom installation or an upgrade installation. And then you obviously need to move on to selecting the actual drive. And then only after that part, do you then find some kind of automation that now runs, where you can literally leave that particular workstation for a while, and then you can always come back after the first reboot in that regard. That's a typical example of an attended installation, because you are there literally, you could say, manually installing your operating system. Then there's an unattended installation where you literally don't have to sit in front of your machine. Once you run that installation, everything is automated, right? The choice of the operating system, the choice of the type of installation, the choice of where that particular OS is going to be installed, the account, the list will go on and on. So that is a typical example of an unattended installation. And how you obviously would do that is being able to create what they call answer files, which would then respond. What you would then respond to manually, right? Your particular answer file there would do it for you. That's where the automated process is all about. So the answer you're looking at there for 2.1 is your Windows SIM, right? And SIM there is short for System Image Manager. That's the one that obviously enables you to create what are known as the unattended Windows setup answer files, as far as your particular installations there would go. So literally, normally you'll find that when you're creating these answer files, you can do that by using information from what is called the Windows image, which is a .wim type of file, and a catalog file, which is a .clg file that is there. So you'll find that component settings are literally added to an appropriate configuration path in the actual answer file there. So what you're looking at here is Windows SIM. And like I mentioned before, that's your Windows System Image Manager. So I think we can just drag it there so that it's a bit visible. And then when it comes to the command line, this is also familiar territory from computer architecture and network architecture, right? Because remember, your command line is a type of interface that you'd use as far as working with your machine there's concerned, not as user-friendly, naturally, because you're supposed to be typing out commands there to run anything or to operate your computer system, if you look at it from a generic perspective. And ultimately, if you don't know the actual syntax or the grammar associated with the actual command, then very difficult for you to function your computer system in this particular setup. But you've got a transmission control protocol over the internet protocol type of utility that enables you to provide IP address information, or that logical address information, as far as your system would go, right? Obviously, the utilities, especially if you're looking at it from a networking perspective, such utilities like your ping enable you to test for connectivity. You've got your trace route, literally enabling you to look at or map an actual pathway from a source to destination. You can also even talk about the whole concept of your NBT stat as a typical example, or netstat, your generic network statistic utility that is there just to check what is actually, even with the routing table setup with the route print that enables you to show the routing table as far as your system would go. But if you want to generically just show IP address information, the default go-to there is an internet protocol configuration utility, right? You can use it with several switches or options like your /all, /flash DNS, and so on, as typical examples of some of the options that are incorporated in that regard. So what you're looking at in this particular instance is your IP config command as far as configurations would go. And that would answer our 2.1 2 there. So it's ipconfig that you're actually looking at in that regard. So that's your answer for 2.2. And let me see if I can quickly share my screen here, 2 seconds, so that we can always look at that again as far as your particular setup is concerned. Yeah, just give me 2 seconds to see if I can share the screen as well. All right, so that's your generic command line. I think we're all familiar with that, right? So the actual command there I was talking about a couple of seconds ago is your ipconfig command. So ipconfig, and then once I hit enter there, and obviously it should literally just display the information associated with the IP address setup that is there. Remember, it can be used with multiple switches. So assuming that you're not familiar with what the switches are, you can still run your ipconfig / incorporate a question mark there, hit enter, and then it will show you the different type of options or switches associated with the actual command in that regard. So the / question mark displays the help message, / all displays full configuration information, / release releases IPv4 address for the specified adapter, and you've got obviously another whole host of options that are incorporated there. So it's just important for you to understand that if you're not familiar with a specific command in terms of the different switches that are there, just hitting / and then with a question mark should do you a world of good in that regard, because you now can see exactly what type of switches or options are associated with that particular command, and makes it a lot easier for you to function it in that distinctive instance as far as setups there are concerned. Like I was saying, with the other type of commands, you've got the ping command. You also have the traceroute command that enables you to just check the amount of hops or the amount of time it takes, or the amount of routers along a specific path, for instance, between source and destination, as far as your particular setup in that regard there is concerned. All right, so we can go back to the actual questions here. All right, so going back to our paper, the minimum RAM required when you're looking at installing a 64-bit version of Windows. So here's the catch now with this particular type of question, right? We already know that if you're running a 32-bit system, you can only access a maximum of 4 gigs of RAM, right? Because the 32 bits literally represent or translate to the width or the size of your address bus, all right? So with 32 bits, you've got a maximum of 4 gigs of RAM that is addressable or accessible. And then with a 64-bit system, you're looking at 16 exabytes of RAM on paper. But obviously, you've got limitations when it comes to the board and the actual systems that you're using in terms of operating systems and applications and so on. So I think on a Windows 10 setup there, you're looking at about 2 terabytes of RAM that can be plugged in as far as your particular system there is concerned. So this type of question is not looking at that. It's looking at what do you need to just get by. So remember, when you look at this particular content in that regard, you've got minimum requirements and recommended, right? So with minimum, that just gets you by, possibly just full, but when it comes to functioning the machine, that can be a bit of a cumbersome process because you're literally running at a minimum spec, right? So what you want to consider is the recommended to ensure that you've got some kind of smooth functionality as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So when it comes to 32-bit systems, right, the minimum RAM required just for installation, not for functionality per se, but just for installation, is 1 gig. And then the one that is applicable when it comes to installation, again, just installation for 64-bit is going to be 2 gig. So just try and remember that with these type of questions, again, goes back to that proper understanding of what is being asked of. because it's quite easy for us to think of the limitations of the 4 gigs and obviously the maximums when you're looking at it from a 64-bit setup in that regard. So here, we're just looking at the minimum required just for installation, not for functionality per se, but just for installation. And then when you're looking at your 64-bit setup there, what you're literally looking at there is your 2 gigabytes as far as RAM is concerned. Right, and then 2.4, you've got your portable versions of Windows that can obviously be plugged in, or that can be used on a USB flash drive or external hard drive in that regard. Instead of having to move around with an actual physical computer system, literally what you can do is utilize the actual thumb drive there in that regard, or your external hard drive, to have your portable version of Windows that you can move around with. All you have to do is just plug it into a computer system that is available to you, run your operating system, do your work on that particular computer system, save your files. Once you're done, unplug your thumb drive, and then you're good to go in that regard. So what you're actually looking at in this particular instance is what is known as Windows to Go, right? Which is obviously a feature within Windows 10, specifically enterprise and education, that enables the creation of that generic workspace that can be booted from a USB connected external drive. That is obviously when you're working with your PCs in that regard. So what you're looking at in that particular instance there is your Windows to Go. That's your answer for 2.4. And then lastly, biometric authentication. So remember, biometric-based technology is all about using a human being's unique physical characteristics or features to gain access to a system, or to gain access to a network, or literally to gain access to an environment. This goes back to the AAA. So this is, I think, one of the questions that you also undertook in your computer architecture exam, right? When you're looking at the AAA, literally you're looking at authentication. What does authentication deal with? It deals with access, right? And how is that access gotten? By using your credentials. So usernames and passwords enable you to gain access to a system, right? But it doesn't end there, because that access is associated with a profile or an account. This is where authorization now, which is the second A, comes in. Because with authorization, what you're looking at is rights and permissions associated with that particular account or profile. So you've gained access to a computer system, or you've gained access to a network, and then you obviously need to have specific rights or permissions associated with your account or profile. And then after that, there has to be some kind of record of what you've done on the system, right? What apps have you accessed? How long were you logged on? What particular network resources did you use? What particular bandwidth? The list will go on and on. And that is where accounting comes in, which is the third A, right? Which is all about auditing, or literally just recording what a specific user, account, or profile has done on the system. So to make this access, which is associated with authentication, more secure, biometric-based technology was designed, right? And that biometric technology, like we were saying a couple of moments ago, just uses a human being's unique physical characteristics to gain access. What are we talking about? Your fingerprint scanners, right? Your retina scanners, facial recognition, voice recognition in certain instances as well. Those are all part and parcel of biometric-based techno, or the features that you obviously use to gain access to the system. So obviously Windows or Microsoft created a platform for that also works with multi-factor authentication, for instance, when you work with your Microsoft Passport, right? But in this particular instance, what you're looking at is the feature that they've actually, or the app that they've used, is your Windows Hello, as far as your specific setup there is concerned. So that's the one that deals with your biometric configurations in that regard. So as far as question 2 is concerned, You've got your Windows SIM for 2.1. You've got your IP config for 2.2. You've got the 2 gigs as a minimum for a 64-bit Windows version. And then you've got your portable Windows 10, which is your Windows to go. Then you've got your Windows Hello incorporated there for your biometric-based technology, specifically authentication in this regard, as far as your particular setup there would go. Question 3, literally, again, within the minimum requirements. I think go and look at that one as well from a research point of view. So 3.1, you should be good in that regard. With 3.2 on the other hand, so this is what I was talking about earlier on. So with 3.1, as you can see, it's not just a question of knowing what's happening with your minimum or recommended requirements, right? There's supposed to be an understanding of why do I need 2 gigs? Why is it that I need 1 gigahertz or faster for my central processing unit? Why do I need a minimum of 20 gig free space on my hard drive? Why is it necessary for me to run DirectX 9 as far as my video graphics drivers are concerned? So in that particular question, as you can see, it's not just about the whole concept of knowing your minimum requirements or recommended requirements, but you now need to justify why you need. So if you look at this particular section there, justify why you need to meet these minimum requirements. Those are the type of questions that are coming in for a take-home kind of setup. It's exactly the same concept if you look at 3.2 there, because you're looking at the 3 most common installation methods. So if you look at I think the second lecture, which is a Windows 10 installation, you've got methods of installation that are there. For instance, your DVD boot, your distributed share installation, your image-based installation. If it was a test here, your question would literally end there where it says Windows 10. And then you obviously list, you get 3 marks, you're good to go. But in this particular instance now, you're required to state your preference. And in stating your preference, you justify your answer, which means that they're testing your knowledge of what a distributed share installation would be, or what an image-based installation is all about, or what a DVD boot would be. So it's not just a question of listing. So this particular question, if you look at the answers, you're looking at your DVD boot installation, you're looking at distribution share, you're looking at image-based. So this question is literally testing, do you know what DVD boot installation is? Right? What actually takes place there? Do you actually know what a distribution share is all about? What actually takes place there? Do you actually know what an image-based installation is all about? What actually takes place in that regard? So in this particular instance now, when you state that, okay, look, I prefer to go with image-based, you now need to state, when you say why, you're literally explaining what image-based is all about. Right? That, okay, possibly I feel more comfortable in that particular setup, much easier for me because everything is configured within an image or an ISO file. The list will go on and on and so on and so on and so on. So you're literally, in your justification, you're literally also explaining what that particular method of installation is all about in those particular and these particular type of questions. So please make sure that you obviously are wary of the type of questioning to make sure that you don't lose out on marks unnecessarily when it comes to contributions in that particular instance. And then you've got your 4.1 there to do with your device driver signing. Again, discuss whether you would use a driver that is not signed or not. All right. Again, literally testing whether you know what driver signing is all about. Right. What is it all about? What does it entail? And remember, a driver is just a piece of software that enables a specific hardware component or peripheral device, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, to function appropriately within a specific operating system. That's what a driver is all about, right? So literally what it means is if I've got a printer and I'm installing it on a Windows 10 machine, I've got a specific driver for that specific printer for that specific OS, which is obviously my Windows 10. If I'm going to be installing it on Windows 8.1, obviously I've got a different driver that is associated in that regard. Same difference will go with Windows 11. Same difference will go with Linux. Same difference would go with your Mac OS, for argument's sake, right? But then these drivers literally need to be tested first to ensure that they function without issue. And this is also coming back to your assignment as well. If you look at 2.3, I think the first part of that is asking you to actually show that all drivers that are there have been literally assigned by Microsoft. So driver signing is just a way of confirming that a specific driver has been tested, and that particular driver has shown that it doesn't have any glitches or doesn't cause any system instability after installation. And then obviously Microsoft signs on that. Remember, when you sign on something, you're confirming contents. So for instance, if you sign a document, you're confirming and legitimizing the contents of that document, right? It's exactly the same concept in this regard, that when you digitally sign on a driver, you're confirming or legitimizing that driver. That's what signing is all about. So what this means now is that when you've got an unsigned driver, it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. The only issue there is that it has not been tested. So after installing your driver, you might discover that your system starts working intermittently now, or you might discover that you work without issue, but obviously at a specific time frame, or after a specific update, or after something has been done on your system, automatically now you're now having issues with your driver, or you're now having issues with the system that would point to that unsigned driver that you've installed. So drivers that are unsigned, it doesn't mean that they don't work. The only thing that it confirms is that it has not been tested, and obviously that we don't know what it will do on our system should we install it. So that's the catch there when you look at again that type of question. That when it says discuss, you're looking at pros and cons in that regard, as far as setups would go. Again, and then also putting up your contribution at the end to say, okay, look, I'd rather go with a signed one, or I'd rather go with an unsigned one, and then give your reasoning behind as far as that particular contribution is concerned. And then with the file systems for 4.2, remember, when you look at any particular storage component, what you're actually looking at there is that every storage component out there has to be formatted first, right? And then when you format it, a lot of individuals confuse formatting with deleting data, right? They think, okay, formatting is all about just clearing the data that is stored on my flash drive or my external hard drive or internal hard drive, whichever way you look at it. But we tend to forget that when you format, you're literally preparing your storage component for use. And how are you doing that? By incorporating an applicable file system. So any storage component out there that doesn't have an applicable file system can literally not be used. You can't store content on that particular component. You can't access any content that is there as far as that particular component there is concerned, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. So the initial file system that was there was FAT, which is short for File Allocation Table. There are obviously certain limitations associated with that were then alleviated by NTFS, right? I think we're all familiar with that. That's another question also that popped up as far as your network, not a computer architecture module is concerned, or exam is concerned, where you're now looking at file and folder security associated with your access control lists, right? That's one advantage. Then you've got a second one, which is redundancy. Then you've got another one, which is the disk quotas. Then you've got your fourth one, which is your cluster sizing. Then you've got your encryption. You've got compression incorporated there, as far as the advantages that NTFS, or the features associated with NTFS, that make it preferable when you compare it to FAT. But now you've got, so here you've got two direct file systems. So we've got FAT, you've got NTFS, right? Discrepancies associated with FAT are obviously distinctively alleviated by NTFS, right? But now you'll discover that with these features that have been incorporated on NTFS would provide some kind of baggage, possibly if you look at it from a different point of view. And at the same time, FAT has these limitations. So there was a need to find something in between right? These, I wouldn't say two extremes, but these two file systems per se, right? That would obviously work for external drives, specifically your flash drives. So something in the middle was created, and that was what is known as exFAT or extended FAT, or in some instances you find it as called FAT64, right? So FAT there, or your extended file allocation table, is literally optimized for flash drives, right? Designed to be lightweight, right? Just like FAT, but at the same time without the extra features of NTFS as far as configurations there is concerned, but literally without the limitations of FAT as well. So in essence, your extended FAT was distinctively designed or optimized for flash drives. And the reason why it's more applicable is that obviously it doesn't have the limitations of FAT. And one of the major limitations of FAT is that there's limits in terms of partitions. There's also limits in terms of you not being able to store any file sizes or any files that are larger than 4 gigs. That's a major limitation when you look at FAT generically. So you've got limitations in the capacity of your partition sizes, and then you also have limitations in file transfers or using files that or storing files that are larger than 4 gigs. So that's why extended FAT was created to accommodate for that in that regard. So it's literally in between FAT and NTFS, but distinctively designed for your flash drives, and specifically lightweight, just like FAT, but without the limitations of FAT, without the baggage or literal overhead associated with NTFS as well in that regard. So that's your 4.2 as far as your particular setup would go. This is exactly what I was also mentioning right at the beginning of the session, right? Where you see that it's been clearly indicated that marks will be awarded for your ability to show how these two concepts are different, right? So obviously the difference between peer-to-peer and your distinctive domain-based networks. So remember, domain-based, it's you could say it's another version of client-server, right? I think this is why it's important for you to look at it from that perspective as well, because when you look at peer-to-peer networking, remember your peer is your equal. So machines within a peer-to-peer network are all equal, right? You don't have a central server that is responsible for storing files, or that is responsible for your authentication, that is responsible for managing user accounts, as well as your particular computer systems within your network, right? And what also determines this is the type of operating system that is running on your particular machines. Normally, you've got client software that is running here, or client operating systems like Windows 10 on all the machines within a peer-to-peer network. But on the other hand, when it's domain-based, you now have a dedicated server. Remember, your server is just a dedicated machine within a network that is responsible for specific services, right? So you've got a server, a dedicated server, or multiple servers within your network there. And then you've got a distinct group of clients as well that are getting their services from these particular server, or that particular server that is plugged in there. That's the main difference that you find. And peer-to-peer, all machines that are there are on the same platform, or literally equal. There's no central server in that particular environment. And literally you've got client software that is running in that regard. So these are more applicable for your small office, home office type of network setups. And ultimately, when you're just looking at sharing files across, and you're literally dealing with share level security in that regard, right? But on the other hand, now when you deal with your client server environments, you've got a specific roles that have been set up there, where a set of computers are clients that gain or get services from a dedicated machine, which is a server within your environment, right? But in this particular question now, it mentions domain-based, which means that server we're talking about in our network environment, right, is a DC or a domain controller, right? And remember, with your DC or domain controller, that's the one that is responsible for managing your credentials, so your usernames and passwords, managing accounts, managing users, managing your particular computer systems. So there's a specific role that this particular server would have in a domain-based network, right? And this is literally the same thing if you look at it from your network architecture module, right? Where you're looking at that virtual environment where you're loading a client, you're now loading a server as well, either in Hyper-V or VirtualBox, and ensuring that these two entities can communicate as far as your specific setup is concerned. Remember, one of the things that you need to do is literally have your client join the domain that you have specified on the server. That's a typical example of what a domain-based network would be. In a type of question like this as well, you're on a bit of an advantage where you can also, if you add or incorporate an image as well in your explanation, this would make it a bit more lucid, and it again would show your understanding of the concept at large in that regard. So typically, if you want to look at it from a different perspective, just adding an image for argument's sake. So again, if I go back here and see if I can share this. So if you look at if you were to naturally incorporate an actual diagram there, just for argument's sake, what you're distinctively looking at in this particular instance now is that when you discuss peer-to-peer, right, as far as your network setups they are concerned, peer-to-peer, you've got something along these lines where you've got computer system A, you've got B, that one is running your Windows 10, that one is also running Windows 10, just for argument's sake, and you've got a direct link or connection that is there, right? That's a peer-to-peer setup, right? Alternatively, you can also incorporate a central device like your switch, for argument's sake, that will connect multiple devices. So you've got a direct setup that is there. Another type of peer-to-peer setup would have your switch there, and obviously computer system B, computer system A. You can also even add in computer system C there, right? These are all obviously running your Windows 10 operating system as far as configurations would go. So that's also Windows 10. This one is also running Windows 10 there. That's a typical example of what a peer-to-peer network would be. There's no central server in that regard, right? As far as basic connections there is concerned, all you've got in terms of connectivity is that central device, obviously, which is your switch, that is availing for connectivity that is there. But then all the machines there are literally equal. There's no distinct roles in that regard. On the other hand, when you look at a domain-based network now, what you now have is, again, you've got your computer system A, obviously running your Windows 10 there, that naturally connects to a distinctive switch, right? That then connects you to another machine there, which is distinctively your server now, which is now running your Windows server 2016, for argument's sake, or 2019 or 2022, whichever way you want to look at it. And then that can also connect another computer system B as well, which literally would be running your Win 10 as well, as far as configurations would go. So this is a typical example of a client server relationship. Why? Because you've got a dedicated server there that is obviously availing for specific services within the network. But in this particular instance, it's important to indicate that this server is not just a generic server. This is actually a DC or domain controller. And the actual setup that you've got as far as configurations would go, remember the domain we could be working with in this particular setup would possibly be example.com. That's the domain that we're in. So anyone that is logging in on this particular network is not logging in on the local machine, but is logging in on the domain. This is exactly the same thing that you do when you walk into any one of the computer rooms on campus. That's a typical example of what a domain-based type of setup is all about, because you're logging onto the network or logging onto the actual domain. You're not logging onto the local machine, or you're not literally using a local account as far as your particular computer system there is concerned. So this is something as well that you can use in terms of solidifying your argument for that particular question by incorporating images that would literally elucidate what's happening with the actual difference between client server or domain-based versus your peer-to-peer network setups in that regard. Right. And then I think the last section that we want to then also look at is, if you go back to the paper, the last section we want to discuss, this is part and parcel of your assignment. So we're not going to spend time on this because it's there in your assignment. Naturally, you should have already gone through that content or literally done some research in that regard. And we've also gone through this as far as our previous lectures they are concerned. 5.3 is also familiar, but I'm going to go and discuss it as well, just to make sure we're on the same page in that regard. They've given you a screenshot. So this is another scenario-based type of question where you've got a specific computer system that cannot connect to the internet, right? So this particular machine cannot connect to the internet. And then as far as that is concerned, you've run ipconfig that we discussed earlier, and you found out that your IP version 4 address is the one that is displayed there, 169 rather, .254.13.241, right? So automatic that is what is known as an APIPA address, right? So if you look at I think I'm just going to populate this, so 5.3.1, there you go. So this is known as an APIPA address, right? And APIPA is short for automatic private IP addressing. And by default, we already know that a private IP address, right, obviously within your IPv4 environments, does not allow us to connect to an external network, or you cannot connect to an external network using a private IP address. Why? Because it's non-routable. It's an internal address or used within your internal configurations, right? So that particular internal address cannot enable us to connect to the network. But if you've got an APIPA address that is ranging from 169.254.0.0 all the way to 169.254.255.255, that literally indicates that we've got a DHCP problem or issue. So it means that our computer system is set to automatically get our IP address from the DHCP server, but for some reason, either we cannot connect to the DHCP server, which means that either the DHCP server is down, is not available, or there's a configuration issue there. So anytime that you find a 169.254 IP address and you're failing to connect to external networks or failing to connect to the internet and so on, that's an automatic indication that we've got DHCP problems in our environment. And specifically what it means is that either the DHCP server is not present at all, or the DHCP server is off, it's down, or we've got a configuration issue associated with that particular setup in that regard. So that's what your configuration would be. I think I've initially incorporated for 5.32 there as well. 5.32. Do we have anything there? No. Okay, so let me populate this accordingly. So if you look at your 5.3.2 in that regard, what this literally means is that DHCP cannot connect to the DHCP server. So you can say here, your computer, or let's just say cannot connect, connect to DHCP server, right? Ultimately, we can also even say DHCP server is down. or not present. Or we've got a configuration issue. And again, specifically DHCP. Let's just say config issue here. Right, so there you go. So that's literally the setup that is there. That the reason why it has this particular address is that it cannot connect to the DHCP server, or the DHCP server is down or not present, or there's a DHCP config issue that you've set this particular machine to get an automatic address from the DHCP server, but either you're supposed to manually set it up, or ultimately, like we were mentioning a couple of seconds back, that the actual server itself is not present in your environment or has not been configured accordingly as far as your specific setup in that regard there is concerned. So literally that's what you're looking at as far as that particular paper there is concerned. To be honest, not as involving, even if you were to come in and sit for this particular paper, but it's just important for you to make sure that you distinctively do the right prep way beforehand. And I've mentioned before that when you look at your ICE, just make sure that you complete the tasks that or the review questions at the end of each individual chapter, just to make sure that it's not just for ICE, but also for proper preparation of the actual assessments at large, as far as this particular module is concerned. Right. Do we have any questions, contributions, or any concerns from anyone as far as this particular past paper there is concerned? So I've mentioned that if you're looking at, I think there are a few questions that I've asked of you to go and do your own research in that regard. But otherwise, in terms of the content that we've gone through, do you have any questions, contributions, or any concerns from anyone? Any questions, contributions, or concerns? Feel free to use the chat section. Let me see if I can just quickly unmute the mics here, or unmute your mic and state your case. Any questions, contributions, or concerns? Right, so nothing's coming through, so I'm assuming we're good to go in that regard. So thanks for attending. Stay safe, keep smiling. See you in the next one. Cheers.